The whispers began on a night like any other. As Jack lay in his bed, he could hear a low murmur, barely audible, like the rustling of autumn leaves. Initially, he attributed it to the wind or some nocturnal creature outside. But as nights passed, the whispers grew louder, the unintelligible murmurs slowly morphing into coherent words, and he knew he couldn't ignore them anymore. Jack had lived in the same house for years, a quaint, old farmhouse that had been passed down through generations. It was set away from the bustling city, surrounded by a thick corpse of trees, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. It was the kind of place that wore its age with a haunting dignity, the kind of place where you could feel the weight of years in every creaking floorboard and drafty corner. He loved the isolation, the peaceful silence that enveloped the property. That was until the whispers began. At first, they were soft, a mere suggestion of sound. But as the weeks passed, the whispers became clearer. Every night, Jack would lay in his bed, the moonlight streaming through the cracked window pane, casting ghastly shapes onto his walls. And listen. He couldn't discern any clear language, but he could hear the cadence, the rhythmic ebb and flow of a conversation taking place just outside of his understanding. He tried to dismiss them, tried to convince himself that it was nothing more than the house settling or the wind sighing through the trees. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent. He felt like he was teetering on the edge of a precipice, the whispers pushing him closer and closer to a yawning chasm of fear. Deciding to face his fears, Jack took a deep breath and called out into the quiet room, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Who's there?" Silence. He waited for a response, but the only sound was the hammering of his own heart. And then, just as he was about to laugh off his own paranoia, the whispering resumed. It was louder this time, more urgent, like a gust of wind howling through a narrow canyon. He could almost make out the words, but they were muffled, like a conversation heard through a thick wall. The whispering continued for several nights, each night growing louder and more insistent. Jack's fear escalated into terror. His once beloved home, now a prison of unease. He tried to find solace in the daylight, but the whispers echoed in his mind, even then, a relentless reminder of the encroaching night. In a desperate bid for peace, he decided to hire a medium, a frail, elderly woman with milky eyes and a serene smile. She stepped into the house and immediately shuddered, a visible ripple of discomfort passing over her. As she moved through the house, her reaction grew more intense. When she reached Jack's room, she stopped dead in her tracks, her face draining of all color. "There's a strong presence here," she said, her voice barely a whisper, echoing the whispers that had plagued Jack for weeks. As the medium started to communicate with the unseen entity, the room turned cold. An uncanny silence fell, replacing the gentle murmuring, and Jack could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles and leaving them in darkness. The whispers exploded into a cacophony of voices, a swirling vortex of sound that filled the room. The words were still indiscernible, but the emotion behind them was palpable. Anger, pain, desperation. Suddenly, the medium screamed. When the lights flickered back on, her face was ashen and she was trembling. I can't continue, she stammered, scrambling to her feet and rushing towards the door. You must leave this house, Jack. It doesn't want you here. But Jack was determined not to abandon his ancestral home. He decided to confront whatever it was that haunted his nights. That night, as the whispers returned, he steeled himself and responded. What do you want from me? The whispers quieted, and then, chillingly, a single voice responded. It was a woman's voice, filled with pain and despair.
Justice. Vengeance.
Over the next few weeks, Jack researched his house's history and discovered a grisly tale. A century ago, a woman named Elizabeth had been brutally murdered. The prime suspect, her husband, was never convicted due to a lack of evidence. Armed with this knowledge, Jack addressed the whisper again. Elizabeth, he called into the darkness. I know what happened to you. As he detailed her murder and the subsequent injustice, the whispers grew erratic, reaching a fever pitch. When he finished, the room fell in an eerie silence. He could almost hear the spectral intake of breath. I'll help you, Elizabeth, Jack promised, his heart pounding against his ribs. I'll make sure everyone knows your story. The next day, he contacted a local historian and shared Elizabeth's tale. Together, they pushed for an official recognition of Elizabeth's unjust death. News spread, and soon, the story of Elizabeth and her tragic end was known far and wide. The following night, Jack waited for the whispers. But the only sound was the quiet rustling of the wind through the trees outside. The house was silent. For the first time in months, Jack slept peacefully. But his peace was short-lived. A week later, Jack woke up in the dead of night, an icy chill permeating his room. The whispers were back, but they were different, louder, angrier. Before he could react, he felt an unseen force gripping his throat, lifting him off his bed. His vision blurred as he choked for breath, the room fading around him. In his final, terrifying moments, Jack realized the truth. The whispers hadn't been seeking justice. They had been biding their time, building his trust, and now Elizabeth had her vengeance. His vision darkened, the whispers echoing in his ears, a terrifying lullaby as he was dragged into the abyss. The last thing he heard was Elizabeth's voice, a chilling whisper in the dark.
Vengeance is mine.